Welcome back. So last month, Alice Walker was asked by the New York Times what books she had on her nightstand. And to a lot of people's surprise, she made mention of a guy by the name of David Icke and recommended one of his books highly. This caused a bit of a minor controversy because David Icke, as it happens, is a New Age conspiracy theorist who claims that he's not really an anti-Semite, but when you read his work, it's kind of anti-Semitic. Alice Walker is a well-known Pulitzer Prize-winning author and an activist, and she's an activist on a subject that I care about deeply, which is the issue of Palestinian rights. Anyone who's familiar with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict knows that the accusation of anti-Semitism is frequently lobbed in a kind of bad faith gesture to discredit people who support Palestinian rights. It's just a sad reality of dealing with that conflict and talking about it. But every now and then there's some truth to it. And this situation with the New York Times kind of raised my antennae. And I started looking into it a little bit. There's no other way to say this. Alice Walker harbors anti-Semitic beliefs. And in this particular poem, she talks about the Talmud. The name of the poem is, let me actually read it so that I get it right. It is our frightful duty to study the Talmud. And in the poem, I'm going to quote from the poem just briefly so that you can get a sense of what's going on here. She writes, quote, "Unlike most Americans, I have witnessed Palestine under Israeli rule. It is demonic to the core, but where to look for the inspiration for so much evil? Where to find the teachings that influence and sanction such limitless, cruel behavior?" And she answers a little bit later in the poem, "It is our duty, I believe, to study the Talmud. It is within this book that I believe we will find answers to some of the questions that most perplex us." End quote. Now, I'm in a very interesting intersection of obligation here. First of all, I've studied Talmud since I was a young boy, growing up in an Orthodox Jewish household. That's sort of part of what you do. I feel a responsibility to set the record straight a little bit about what the Talmud is and what it isn't. As a person who cares about Palestinian rights, it's very important for me to call out members of the community when they do spread anti-Semitic ideas and when the accusations against them aren't the typical false bad faith accusations, but there's actually some truth to them. Alice Walker actually recommends that people use YouTube as a way to learn about the Talmud. And so as a member of the YouTube community, I feel responsible to counteract a lot of the misinformation. And there's a lot of misinformation about the Talmud on YouTube. And so that's what I'm going to do with this video. To make sure I get this right, I went to the American Jewish University and sat down with Rabbi Dr. Aryeh Cohen, who walked me through the history of the Talmud, some of its misconceptions, and other issues related to this. And if you stick around to the end of the interview, you'll even get a little taste of what it's like to study Talmud. Thank you so much, Aryeh, for agreeing to help me through some of these issues and help our audience understand a little bit more about the Talmud. Before we get started, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you came to study and teach Talmud?
I'm Aryeh Cohen. I'm a professor of rabbinic literature here at the American Jewish University. I'm also a rabbi. I'm also part-time rabbi in residence at Bend the Arc Jewish Action, a Jewish social justice organization. My history with Talmud is like life. In other words, in the sense that, I fell out of love, I fell in love. I moved from studying Talmud in a yeshiva to studying Talmud in kind of a think tank. I don't know how I would describe Hartman's, but it's more like a think tank setting, to studying Talmud in the university. And I did my doctorate in Talmud and pursuing the questions of how to create a methodology to read legal discussions as literary texts in order to ask questions about the construction of gender and diaspora, which sounds very academic.
That is very academic, and hopefully we'll get to some of that. But before we do, just some basics for our audience. What is the Talmud? When was it written, and who wrote it?
In the timeline, The Five Books of Moses was, we're talking about finally being edited around the 5th century before the Common Era. There are people who go way later than that. There are people who go way earlier than that. It's not a debate we want to get into right now. The books. Then there's the prophets and writings, which are later. They're somewhat dated. So in that in-between period between like the 5th century and the year 0, during that time, there was a lot of ferment, religious ferment, in what's we refer to as the land of Israel. Two of the major streams that came out of that and survived were the Jesus followers, who eventually, outside of the land of Israel, became Christians, and through the mediation of Paul, and Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism and the early Christians grew up around the same time. The original name of the rabbis were Talmidei Chachamim. They were the students of the sages. The sages were a guild. Right? It was a guild of folks who learned a specific curriculum. And that curriculum eventually became kind of codified in the Mishnah. So in short, Mishnah is the cornerstone text of Rabbinic Judaism. The two Talmuds are commentaries on Mishnah, on Mishnaic law. One was written in Palestine, edited in the 5th century, more or less. The other was written in Babylonia and finally edited in the 6th, 7th century.
But the one that actually takes pride of place in Jewish history ends up being the Babylonian Talmud. I'd like to know what your answer is to what role the Talmud plays in the Jewish religion, and then also what role does it play in Jewish culture more generally? I think a lot of people don't realize that, for sure today, but I think for a long time, the majority of the Jewish population have not been particularly religious. It's been a long time since that's been the case. So the way I think about it is that you need to account for the role within religious cultures, and then you also need to account for it in the sort of larger secular cultures that Jews have. So what do you think about those?
So it's interesting. If you think about the long history of Talmud from the time that it was published till today, it went in and out of favor, and it was more popular in different places in the world. So Franco-German Jewry, which is, for Jews, France and Germany was one country. There, the text to study was Talmud. As opposed to that, in Spain, Talmud had a backseat. The more important pursuits there were philosophy, were Bible study, and mystical study, and there were major controversies within the Jewish community about what you should study.
So in these religious communities, the Talmud is functioning as a springboard for practical Jewish legal issues? Is that?
Yes, and. Notice there's both practical. We have what I guess would be called proceedings of the court of Rabbeinu Tam, who had lived in Dampierre in the late 12th century in northern France. And, it's kind of, his ox ran into my house and knocked down the wall. What do I do? And Rabbeinu Tam said, this is what you do. But at the same time, there was also the more important religious pursuit of just the study of Talmud for its own sake. And most of the meta-commentaries on Talmud are not about practical legal issues. And side by side with that, there's also those who use Talmud to pursue theological issues, religious issues, because the Talmud, and I can't stress this enough, the Talmud is not merely a discussion of legal issues. It's also theology and religion and folktales and mysticism, and that's why in the Babylonian Talmud, this is all in one book. In the Palestinian tradition, you had the Talmud, and then you had other books which are collections of Bible commentary and lore and things like that. Ashkenazi Jewry took with them the centrality of Talmud. You go into most Orthodox and conservative synagogues, you'll have a Talmud class. You go into any Orthodox synagogue, you'll have a Daf Yomi, where 7-year cycle that you study a page of Talmud a day. The interesting thing about that is that it's not that everybody who's in that class could study Talmud on their own or really understand, but it's become a cultural activity, right? What do I do? What makes me a Jew? I study Talmud, and Talmud has achieved that marker, right? And there's even there was an interesting article where discussing Yiddish literature in the early 20th century, in which it was noted that the anarchists and the communists, those who were more dedicated, would talk about their anarchism and their communism in Talmudic terms, because that's what a Jew was.
Why do you think anti-Semites are so obsessed with the Talmud?
So this goes back. I think there's a long history to this. I think first Christians were obsessed with the Talmud because they thought the Talmud was hiding the secret that Jesus was actually the Son of God. And so...
what do you mean hiding? What does that mean?
Oh, that if you really understood the Talmud, you would find out that the Jews had already admitted that Jesus was the Son of God. So,
what?
So that's why there are copies of the Talmud in the Vatican that were written in the 13th, 12th century that were actually commissioned by the Vatican.
Wait, so I need you to take a step back for a second. So the idea is that a correct understanding of the Talmud would lead to Christianity?
More than that, that the Jews were not admitting that they had already figured out that Jesus was the Messiah, and they just weren't telling anybody.
Because Jews?
Because Augustine, Jews are stiff-necked people who will not, that's Augustine's whole thing. The Jews are stiff-necked people, therefore they have to be, they did not accept Jesus as Messiah, so therefore they have to be cursed and persecuted, but not
It's like
killed.
it's like a proto-conspiracy theory of...
It is. Now, I'll tell you how it gets to the conspiracy theory, because first you have that, and then you have a number of Jewish converts to Christianity who knew how to read Talmud. So we have to remember the Talmud is, in contemporary printed editions, is 24 volumes, and each volume is more than one tractate of Talmud, and with all kinds of meta commentaries. It's written in Aramaic and Hebrew. It takes a lot to be able to study it, right? So it looks like, it's not like, the Bible is 5 books. You can read it over a weekend, right? And still have time to binge on Netflix. But the Talmud, you can't, right? So there's a lot there, and it's very technical. There's a lot of technical language. It's not just that if you know Aramaic, which was also a Christian language in late antiquity, that you can know Talmud. You have to know how the Aramaic works. So once you have something that looks like a mystery, so it becomes mysterious, and that lends itself to conspiracy. So the first conspiracy was that this was what generated a lot of, what are called the disputations in the Middle Ages, where the church would force some rabbinic leader, some of the great rabbinic leaders like Nachmanides, to publicly debate a representative of the church over, which religion is right. And a lot of the debates had to do with textual proofs from Talmud. So what I used to tell my students when I taught medieval civilization is that in order to understand medieval civilization, you have to realize that if you had the wrong idea of God, you would get killed. This is probably the most foreign idea to contemporary culture.
Which is a great success of contemporary culture.
Yes, exactly. And so once it became pretty clear to everybody that Jews weren't hiding the fact that they already knew that Jesus was what they thought, was that then the Talmud was dangerous for 2 different reasons. First of all, there are a couple stories in the Talmud about Jesus which are not very flattering, which is really surprising because you have 2 competing religions and one is telling non-flattering stories about the other, as in the opposite way. There are also kind of popular folk literature where you get a lot of the stories about the book of Josephum, where you get a lot of the really raunchy stories about Jesus being born to a prostitute and stuff like that, and actually the burning and excrement stuff. That comes from these folk literature kind of things. But they found out that Jesus was mentioned, and Jesus is mentioned a couple dozen times in Talmud. Sometimes in really interesting ways. Sometimes he's mentioned as one of the rabbis. Sometimes he's mentioned as an idolater who's started competing awful religion. So then the church said, oh, this is terrible. This is heretical. This is, will cause apostasy. We have to burn it. So there was the great burning of the Talmud in Paris first, and then other burnings of the Talmud. Now, once the Vatican, which was the church then, in Western Christianity, decides that this book is dangerous, so then it gets a certain sheen of containing deep knowledge of how the world really works. That wasn't weaponized until kind of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which comes around in the 19th century. But you already have there more than the seeds, kind of the outline of a conspiratorial theory of the Jews have a program for powering the world, because you have this set of books that I don't understand. And if I don't understand them, they probably hold a mystery which is written by people who are other than me, who are different than me, who, in Matthew's description of the crucifixion, claimed the blood of Jesus was on their hands. St. Augustine said that they have to be oppressed and punished. So they're obviously a demonic force in the world. And here's their books. So the books must contain the secrets of how they do that stuff.
I think it's really important to point out that this Christian history, because you see to this day, and one of the reasons that I want to talk about this is the whole Alice Walker situation in the poem that she wrote, and we'll get to that in a minute here. But you see, if you follow her path, which is, she says, don't Google because there's unreliable information on Google, but go to YouTube, which Google owns, but that's neither here nor there. But she says, go to YouTube. So I did. I went to YouTube, and a lot of the sort of misinformation about the Talmud on YouTube is coming from Christians. And it's coming from a very strong Christian perspective. And this history, I guess, it's really important to bring it up. But there's another side. We were just talking about how society has achieved something great, that people can't imagine a time in which, thinking the wrong thing about God could mean life or death. And I do believe that. But there's a flip side to that, which is that we also have generations and generations of people who just do not understand how religions function in the world. And so you end up with people mining a text like the Talmud for any kind of illiberal idea that they can find, and then sort of weaponizing that as a kind of anti-religious without even understanding.
So let me illustrate this from a different angle. And what I want to illustrate is that our category of religion is a Christian category of religion, a very Western category of religion, and a Christian category of religion, which the academy, people in the universities have been talking about this for a long time. But popularly, it's still what religion means, which is that religion has to do with ritual, it has to do with sacred space and sacred time, it has to do with specific edicts, and when you have books, they tell you what to do. Religion, and that's why the category of religion is actually unhelpful in describing other religions which are not Christian. So the Talmud is a life, right? In the sense, it is describing a life, which means it is describing everything from waking up in the morning to going to sleep at night. It is describing everything from going to the bathroom to having sex, from birth to death. And it's telling stories. It's telling fabulous tales. It's telling, there's a wonderful tale about how every night Elijah has to wake up Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob so that they could praise God, but he can't wake them up at the same time, otherwise redemption will come. So he always gets to the study hall late, so therefore one of the rabbis constantly screams at Elijah for coming to school late, right? And the rabbis had a sense of humor. The rabbis were snarky. When they talked about Roman gods, they punned on their names so that their names sounded like awful things, right? All this is part of a sacred text. It doesn't sound like a sacred text, right? The other thing is that study became the central mode of worship. The rabbinic tradition of study, it's about the words and then playing with the words and understanding the words and playing with the concepts. And so that is a far cry. And so therefore you have this sprawling mass of statements and discussions and conversations and lore and law and fabulous tales and pietistic tales. And in there you have other stuff. I mean, Talmud was written in a patriarchal culture, which is where misogyny ran deep, just like every other culture. It was written in a state of oppression. Jews were not independent for any of the amount of time. It was written outside of the land of Israel when the land of Israel was the centrally holy space in the world. And so all of these things play into it. And so you have fantasies of revenge, right? You have, obviously they had to answer the question, if Jews are the chosen people, how is it that we're so unchosen? Right? And that was actually when we talked about the medieval disputations. That was one of the main questions was, if you think you're so great, why are we ruling you?
That was a Christian argument.
A Christian argument, yes.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that there aren't sexist and misogynistic and xenophobic and racist statements in the Talmud. There are. Of course there are. If there weren't, well, that would have been a sign that it was revealed directly from heaven. They lived in a culture. They lived in a world. There was the Talmud was created in a slave society. And as a contemporary Jew, we have to struggle with these things. This is part of our heritage. When you have a heritage that we're blessed with a 2,500-year-old heritage, we are also cursed with a 2,500-year-old heritage, because you have Jews who lived within cultures, and not as an apologetics, but this is just the truth. Jews who lived within cultures which justified lots of behaviors which we would think are awful and offensive. And so they made statements which are awful and offensive. Now, they also made statements which are amazingly aspirational. They also made statements which are amazingly sophisticated.
You're a progressive activist. I think it would be fair to... Is that a fair characterization?
That's fair. Totally fair.
When these sorts of issues come up, where it's not the sort of typical, broadside false claim of anti-Semitism against someone who's critical of the state of Israel, but there's meat on those bones. How does that make you feel?
So the truth is that I feel fatigued. It's like, seriously? And we're still having this conversation? Especially somebody like Alice Walker, whose work I appreciate and read. I didn't remember the whole history of her anti-Semitism. It's kind of complicated with her family relationships. But really? That's kind of the basic attitude. It's like it proves again and again the adage that somebody could be so smart and so silly at the same time. And unfortunately, the silliness is the seed of something that could be really dangerous and risky. It's like, for her the things that she says in that poem, it's obvious that she has no idea what the Talmud is. And it's unfortunately obvious that she's reading everything within a Christian lens, right, which is also the same lens that, as other people have pointed out, fuels the white supremacy, which she spent so much time both analyzing, exposing, and deconstructing. I'm kind of gobsmacked that somebody at that level of cultural production, which necessitates nuanced vision, could be so blind to some basic understandings of how religion works and could be taken in by these conspiracy theories. I don't think that there is an inherent connection between Walker's anti-Zionism and her anti-Semitism, because they're drawing from different places. The only thing that what she's doing when she does that, when she says that if you want to know how Palestinians are oppressed or how people in Ferguson are killed, look in the Talmud, she's just saying Jews are responsible for everything. Where a lot of anti-Semites make fun of Talmud because it's all casuistic, right? How do we reconcile these things which are seemingly irreconcilable? Actually, conspiracy theories are the height of casuism. How do we right? How do we show that all these things lead to this thing?
There's something very Talmudic about conspiracy theories.
Brisker conspiracy theorists.
Aryeh, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
This has been a pleasure. And we're going to learn something now, yeah?
Yes. Welcome to the world of Talmud. This is a page of Talmud from Bava Batra, which means actually the last gate, part of the 3 gates of the volume which was once a single volume of torts, or nizikin. This is the first chapter of Baba Batra. If you look at the page, you actually have a really concise history of the Jewish textual tradition, starting with Mishnah here, which we mentioned earlier, 3rd century, the Babylonian Talmud commentary on Mishnah, which is after here, is from much later, the 7th century, even perhaps a little later. On the inside column, we have the commentary of Rashi from northern France in the 11th century, 12th century, died in 1106. 1105, 1106. On the outside column are a school of commentators who are Rashi's grandchildren. The main one is Rashi's grandchildren. The Tosafists, also from northern France. Rabbeinu Gershom is also an Ashkenazi commentary. Sometimes you have Rabbeinu Hananel, who is also a North African commentator. Okay, from a little earlier, from the 10th century, 11th century. Okay, now that as our map, we are going to delve into one law or one legal discussion. We'll see how Talmud is a legal discussion rather than a law book. Here we go. Mishnah. Kofin oto livnot beit shar v'delet lechatzer. So one is, we can force him to build a gatehouse and a door to a courtyard. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer lo kol hachatzerot ru'uyot leveit shar. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says not all courtyards need or are appropriate for a beit shar, for a gatehouse. Now, the questions that immediately pop up are kofinoto. They can force him. Who is the they, and how does one force? We immediately see that this is not talking about kind of voluntaristic organization, but rather this is a legal system which is dependent upon a court system and a judicial, some kind of a police force. One can force their neighbors. What is the situation we're talking about? It's kind of in our days, we would think of it as a condominium. If you live in a house, there are rules about what you're allowed to do. If you live in a historical district, there are rules about what you can do with your house. Can you paint the door red? Here the question is, if you're living in a courtyard, which has a number of apartments around a central courtyard, and most of the people in the courtyard want to build a gate leading out to the public domain so that people can't get in, and want to put a gatehouse on that gate so that a guard can sit there, can all the residents be forced to chip in for that gatehouse and gate? So there are two opinions. The first opinion, which is anonymous, not attributed, says you can, that a person, that the rest of the residents of the gatehouse can force the one resident who doesn't want to pay to chip in. That, by suing him, or other places in the Talmud, by physical violence, by police violence. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, a sage, a Palestinian sage, says that not all courtyards are worthy of a gatehouse. Right? Just because the courtyard down the block has a gatehouse doesn't mean that you need a gatehouse also. Okay, so we're going to skip the second half of the Mishnah, which is equally fascinating, and we're going to go immediately to the commentary of the Talmud, which we know is what we're doing when we pass this little, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little thing that says Gemara, or Talmud, is we're jumping ahead several centuries. Lememra, this is to say, that is, this law in the Mishnah that tells us that we are allowed to force somebody to contribute to paying for the gatehouse and the gate. Lememra debate shar mal yutahi. This tells us, the implication here is that a gatehouse is a good thing, meaning that if we wouldn't establish a public policy that somebody's allowed to force somebody to do something if it was a bad thing, we hope. So the implication is that it's a good thing. V'ha, but hahu chasida dahava ragil Eliyahu dahavi mishtai bahadeh. There was this chassid, this righteous person. And righteous person is actually a technical term, but that's neither here nor there right now. But a righteous person is, as you would think, a righteous person who Elijah the prophet would always come and have conversations with. Now, Elijah the prophet is a unique figure in Talmud in that the rabbis understood that Elijah hadn't died, because if 2 kings, if you remember your biblical stories, in 2 Kings, Elijah It never says that Elijah dies at the end of his career when he gives over the mantle to Elisha. Rather, Elijah just goes up to heaven in a storm. And so the rabbis understood Elijah as not having died. And so every once in a while, Elijah makes an appearance. And here, apparently, Elijah was making an appearance on a regular basis, talking with this guy because this guy was righteous. But Avad Beit Shar, this righteous person, built a gatehouse, Vitu la mishtai badeh, and Elijah no longer appeared to him, which seems to imply that Elijah was protesting against the gatehouse. So now we have a contradiction between this story and our Mishnah, which says that it's okay to build a gatehouse. So immediately, of course, the Gemara does what it does, which is in the dialectic form, says la kasha. It's not really a problem. And then distinguishes between the two cases. And we're not going to read through all of it because there are 6 ways in which one can resolve this contradiction between the two cases, and that's not anomalous for Talmudic dialectics. However, it seems that all of these things are having to do with, it seems, access to, who gets access to the courtyards. What's interesting is that if we look at Rashi, if we jump forward another half a millennia to Rashi, Rashi comments on La Ishtai Badeh, that Elijah no longer spoke to the poor person. Lefishim mafsik ba'aniyim hatzoakim ve'ein kolam nishma. Because the gatehouse would serve as a barrier, as a buffer, for the poor people who were calling out and their voices weren't heard. And Rashi repeats that comment a number of times during this dialectic. Because the door to the courtyard is locked and the poor person will yell, and the gatehouse serves as a buffer to stop his voice. So the question that comes to mind is, how does Rashi know anything about poor people? The Mishnah doesn't say anything about poor people. The Talmud doesn't say anything about poor people. Rashi immediately understands this legal discussion as implicating the people in the courtyard in a manner of behavior which has to favor the poor. Now, there's a whole way of understanding that the word soek itself is an index, is an indicator of something else that's going on here. There's a biblical, if we follow the word soek, cry out, back to its biblical origins, we will see that that is the verb that's used when in Exodus 3, God hears the cries of the children of Israel. He hears their tza'aka. That's the same exact word, which appears a number of times, which is very suggestive of the fact that Rashi hears something going on here much worse, which is not just a specific instance of ignoring the cry of the poor, but rather that being able to hear the cry of the poor, setting up your city so that you don't have dwellings where it is impossible to hear the cry of the poor, is a fundamental way in which we have to think of our urban spaces. Our urban spaces must be set up such that we can hear the cry of the poor. It's obvious to Rashi and the Gemara that if you see a poor person, you're going to help them. But we have to go beyond that. And this is why Elijah left. Because the righteous person, who obviously would have given money to the poor if he had seen them, built a gatehouse, and with the gatehouse there, he would no longer be able to hear the cry of the poor, and therefore wouldn't have the opportunity to interact with the poor person, and the poor person would be set apart from the community. And so we see here a perfect example of how we have a legal discourse, a legal discussion, which is brought into a fantastical discussion of an interaction between Elijah and a righteous person, which is then, through the interpretive comments of Rashi, brought back to a discussion of justice and not only what is legally correct. Talmud.
So that's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe to my channel. And there will be lots more coming in 2019.